welcome yourself and our guests to today's event. As a speaker, as I was saying, as a proud mother, grandmother, great-grandmother who has worked and lived in Ghana, Nigeria, Canada, and the US, where she's currently based, and the UK. She graduated with a PhD in the US with a focus on African culture, women, and education. She has written articles, chapters, encyclopedia entries, and 3 books, amongst which are African Mothers, published by SUNY Press in 1998, The Afrocentric School, published in 2001, and then she's just co-authored a book called Being Human Being, which was published alongside Dr. Molefi Kente Asante, a well-known pioneer of Afrocentric theory. And she's been involved in developing African-centered and Afrocentric schools across the globe. She's currently an assistant professor of Africology at Temple University in the US. And so we come with a very distinguished speaker, as I said, and it's an honor and delight to have a speaker on a topic which is the significance of culture to life in the pursuit of democratic principles. Professor Dove, it's like I said, great absolute pleasure to have you talk on this important topic. We look forward to hearing you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me, and I come here as an Africologist, as you said, from the Department of Africology and African Studies, African American Studies at Temple University, trained by Dr. Molefi Kente Asante. And this is a momentous occasion because tomorrow is the last day that he will be the chair of the department. And so I'm hoping to represent Africology in the best way that I can, having benefited so much from the department as a professor there. So I thank you for the introduction, and I will do my best to outline the work of Sheikh Anta Diop so that it would become clear that we need to move ourselves outside the race paradigm and address ourselves in cultural ways so that we can see differences among people relating to cultural differences and not race differences. So I hope that I can show my PowerPoint and then have questions relating to the PowerPoint and anything that I know that could add to it, because obviously a PowerPoint can't elaborate. It's simply, in my case, and in this case, it's a sort of theoretical ideal. And from that, we can go into the realities of life as we live it. So I hope that you will.
Yes, I think I should add that you're expected to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes at the first instance, and then we'll take some questions, if that's okay with you.
Okay, then you probably did tell me and I probably forgot, so I apologize for that, but that should be, yes, no problem at all.
Okay.
So I'd like to share the screen with you if I can. So I'll share the screen. And I don't know why this is here. gosh, let me stop the share. Sorry, this is entirely my fault. I thought I was ready. It's this that I need to share. And okay, I'm using the great Senegalese scholar Sheikh Anta Diop to explain his theory, and in doing so, I will look at the constructions within culture of hierarchy, patriarchy, race, and domination, and we'll touch upon all these constructs, cultural and social constructs. I begin with a picture of the great man in his laboratory in Senegal, just so we, I'm sure you are familiar with him, but it's sometimes nice to see the person that we're speaking of. Okay, I picked on John Henrik Clarke because he's one of our greatest historians in the US, who says that all African people everywhere are closer to a better understanding of their history and destiny because of the personality and work of Sheikh Anta Diop. So among us, among our community in the US, we greatly respect him, but there are many who try to defame his name and debase his character and try to make him not worthy of the great accolades that he is so deserving of. Ife Amajume said in Igbo language, referring to Dr. Diop, Ebonu Ji Isi Ogu, brave ram who fights with his head. Dr. Amajume is a Diopian theorist, and she has always focused on women. And you know, she's a great inspiration to those like myself who come from Diop's perspective in understanding cultural distinctions and the actual role of women. So Sheikh Anta Diop was born in Diourbel, Senegal in 1923. And I'm reading what I'm saying essentially for those who are short of hearing, so that they can, and those who are short of seeing. That happens. We always have to be prepared for that in the university. He created the two cradle theory and argued that the southern cradle, Africa, is the birthplace of humanity, and that cultural unity exists all over Africa, and that this is what we are seeking, that this unity is critical to developing a better future. Cultural identity formation is critical to developing this cultural unity. So it's very much a cultural, educational, and epistemological situation. The two distinct cradles are the southern and northern. The cradle, the southern cradle, is Africa, and is the birthplace of humanity, scientifically so. All humans' mitochondrial DNA traces back to the southern cradle. And we humans, modern humans, are known as Homo sapiens, and we're at least 350,000 years old. Humans did not leave the southern cradle until 70,000 years ago. And one might say, well, how relevant is that to what we're trying to understand about the current day situations? Here's a picture. I put that there because it really shows, one, how huge Africa is on the globe, and it's always minimized in all the literature that we ever read, and yet many countries of the world can fit into Africa, and this is a satellite picture of Africa. So we're not supposed to really see this or have it formed in our mind of any significance and importance, but it is as the cradle of civilization. All people who exist today are Homo sapiens, in other words, Africans. So we are actually 99.9% the same, which is very hard to understand when we're learning that we're all different races of people. But there is a motive to that. Africa produced the first culture, so one looks at it in the way, in the Africological way. The foundation of every culture is based on the relationship between female and male, who produce life and culture. And the first culture, born in the southern cradle of civilization, was grounded in the reciprocity between the female and the male. They are the mothers and fathers of humanity and culture, the first culture that we all practiced, even when we left Africa. It's called by Sheikh Anti-Joe, female and male reciprocity harmony is called African matriarchy. Some have issues with the idea of matriarchy, which is usually the opposite of patriarchy, where the woman rules the man. But it has been used so that we can use the current terminology, but we must always recognize that African matriarchy is the balanced reciprocal relationship between women and men. This culture produced divinity and ethical and moral substance of Ma'at, the divine mother. This is very important to the idea of balance, the things that Ma'at stands for, but I am looking at democracy as one of those principles that Ma'at stands for. So some of the values and beliefs that exist still today, but came out of the cradle, are respect and love of and for the woman as mother. Mothering is considered to be a high ideal and status, so gender is irrelevant. If one is loving and compassionate, one can be considered a mother, which is a high status. Ancient spiritual systems exemplify the indivisibility of female-male as creator, which we have plenty of evidence of. It is non-hierarchical, egalitarian, democratic, and balanced. So this is the first culture that we're speaking of that African people produced. A person is judged by what she, he, they contribute to the world. Ancestral recognition and respect are ways that we understand who we are and who those before us contributed to the development of humanity. Some Africans left the southern cradle 70,000 years ago, and these African people populated the world. Environments developed new phenotypes. Indo-Aryans, European phenotypes are possibly around 2,000 years old, according to Joe and science. Over time, the culture of African matriarchy changed. The domination of the woman by the man and father produced patriarchy. Patriarchal culture stands in opposition to African matriarchal culture. Patriarchy produced the first hierarchy. Patriarchy produced the first injustice, because clearly the woman being dominated by the man That is first injustice, and there is very much evidence of this in the current religious beliefs, like Hinduism or Brahmanism, Hebraic beliefs, Christian beliefs, and Islamic beliefs, where the mother of humanity, of course, who is Black, is seen to be morally corrupted in the story of creation. So she is viewed as lower in the scale of the superiority of the woman and man, and that is, a major feature of patriarchy. As I said, it produced the first injustice, the debasement of the African mother of humanity, and this belief in her debasement is ensconced in the religions. Control of the woman in the Northern Cradle. We've moved on to the Northern Cradle values and beliefs. She's inferior to the man. Control of nature, as nature is seen as the enemy of human existence, which, we live in this, so we know this to be true. Hierarchies and of superiority and inferiority are some of the values and beliefs. Xenophobia, the fear of the other who is viewed as the enemy, and of course that's perfectly normal because there's always the predilection to maintain that relationship and fear that it can be changed. The practice of aggression, war, domination, subjugation, greed, lies, jealousy are necessary features of patriarchy because they justify the control of women, family, society, the nation, nature, and humanity. This is what we're living in, sort of as a global social context, cultural context at the moment. This is very real. At one time, the whole world was populated by dark-skinned humanity, and those of the Northern Cradle, Indo-Aryans, lost touch with their African ancestors and created patriarchy. That was after leaving Africa. They traveled the world and met their African ancestors whom they did not recognize. When they came back, they lost touch. And when they came back, they had new ideas, new religions, which have formulated into these modern religions that are all patriarchal, that many of us practice and believe in. They took advantage of the gentleness, knowledge, and higher learning of those who practiced African matriarchal values. They were jealous of their accomplishments and beauty. The patriarchs conquered those who practiced African matriarchal values and took their sacred lands, possession, wealth, and knowledge because they perceived these good people, these beautiful people, to be childlike because they were not emitting vibration at that level of thinking and being. They were far more materialistic. If I can't see it, it doesn't exist, that type of world that we're living in now. And so African higher knowledge, which still exists, and we're all trying to aspire to reaching these levels of being, which we haven't yet reached, but our ancestors were the ones who knew these ways of being before conquest. Where these two cultures met, Diop called zones of confluence. So where patriarchy met African matriarchy, these were zones of confluence. And also remember that when they met, it was always the patriarchy patriarchal culture that dominated and conquered the matriarchal culture. In that setting, one can understand why most people become believers of patriarchy, because it's about domination, dominating the African woman. Two of these zones of confluence that Job speaks about are India and Arabia. I'm just showing the Khoisan people, some people of South Africa, and it's probably a very outdated picture, but it's just a reminder that these scientists recorded the movements of the moon, which is still in evidence around 43,000 years ago. So whereas we're trained as academics in all the traditional European disciplines to look at ourselves in a very sort of negative light as being primitives, and that's one of the great things that Dr. Deal did, was as an anthropologist, he was able to turn anthropology on its head, which was based on the hierarchy of humanity, looking at the European white culture as the most sophisticated and brilliant scientific culture, and African culture at the bottom of the hierarchy as being primitive. And Joe looked at the evidence to show that it was actually the other way around. So that's why his work is not fashionable, and most people do not want to hear about him or his knowledge. Here's a UK skeleton, which has recently been shown, probably in the last 10 years or 5 years, and admitted that, you know, African people populated Europe, and the, you know, the UK in particular. So this is 9,000 years old, just of interest. And then there is the carving in the British Museum of Ramses III. And here it is the temple, the tomb design, which shows the people themselves and shows you that the ancient Egyptians were African, just like the rest of Africa. One of those best kept secrets. So the zones of confluence, the conquest of Africa was really the conquest of African matriarchy by Indo-Aryans and patriarchs. This violent imposition produced Arab types in the race paradigm called Semites, a mixture of the African and Indo-Aryan, who took on patriarchy as their cultural preference. They constructed race and religion to justify the taking of sacred lands and their right to enslave original African people, Black people. So there's a hierarchy there of when one becomes Arabized or Islamized, that, you know, there's a belief in the inferiority of the Blackest person, who are our teachers. In India, the Indo-Aryans conquered the Africans because Africans populated it everywhere. So if you look at the works of Satima, Runoko Rashidi, Wayne Chandler, these people who have always searched for the African origin of any place that they visit, and they will always find that, because African people in Iraq or Iran or anywhere really have been, all over South America, have been hidden. And people are not just there because they've been enslaved and taken there, but they are there because they are the original people there. So in India, the Indo-Aryans conquered the Africans and constructed race, caste, which we're calling caste, but actually it's just race, to justify the stealing of the sacred lands of knowledge and their right to enslave and debase the original Black people. So at the bottom of their religious hierarchy, they have the Sudras, who are within the religion, the Brahmin religion, and those outcasts, called the untouchables, are the people who have married outside their supposed race or caste. So if a red person marries a Black person, then that the children of that become the untouchables. So the untouchables, although they're linked to the Sudras, they are not all Black like the Sudras in terms of hue. So you will get lighter skinned people depending on which race married into which race, or caste as they call it. They followed their Indo-Aryan fathers and not their African mothers, evidenced in holy texts, and they learned to disrespect their mothers. So all these modern religions, they disrespect the mother. So again, just to go over, we're all Homo sapiens sapiens, we're 99% genetically the same. Our behaviors, values, beliefs are culturally determined. We're influenced by the cultures that we live in. There are two types of culture based on woman and man, because they are the smallest unit that can create life and culture. So these hierarchies, like race, gender, sex, are northern cradle beliefs. So people often think that when we're talking about the hierarchy of humanity, they're coming from Marxist positions and so on, or socialist positions. They're all saying, what about class? What about class? And class is really an aspect of this cultural domination. And in all of these classes of people, or grades of people, or superiorities and inferiorities, at the base of all of them are always the blackest skinned people. And, you know, when people get into class, they like to forget race, which is the construction to separate us all. The conquest of Africa was the conquest of the Black mother. The application of the two cradle theory enables scholars to understand that differences in thoughts, ideas, episteme, behaviors, information among humanity. We are culturally oriented. Humans produce culture, it produces us. We produce episteme and it produces us. So culture moves away from the race paradigm of European, Southwest Asian, patriarchal and racist genetic and moral constructs of who African Black people actually are. The race paradigm is a falsehood, a lie. It doesn't exist. Only by the cruel application of a belief, lie, taught as truth, that has been guilty of justifying the deaths of hundreds of millions of Africans and others, such as the red people, supposed red people of the lands that we live on in America and across all the Americas. At least 68 million people, maybe more, were killed of those people. You know, but that's not written, that's not, we're not notified about this, but in research around Americans or indigenous to the continent, it's found that they continue to practice African values and beliefs. And so even though they've phenotypically changed, they still uphold the values and beliefs that they came with. And that is perceived to be a weakness. And as I've said before, that this higher learning has now become the weakness to kill people and take their lands without mercy. And if you keep them there, to use them in one's own interest. When we use the race paradigm to analyze our course of liberation, we're constrained by anti-African Black beliefs. Africans cannot make the lie of race a theoretical truth. The Pan-European Academy and schooling strive to maintain such beliefs on a global scale. So it's a massive structure, cultural structure in the academic world, which is the brain. This produces the ideas and episteme that we value, are taught to value, to define what's going on in the world. We're all elite because we have access to this and we are in it. And obviously, you know, we in it, but we cannot be of it because it's not in our interests. Our interests are to develop truth that can affect us, humanity, African humanity, and particularly in a positive way, bring back the knowledge that we once knew. The cultural paradigm enables us to see the effects of the race paradigm created to enforce a way of thinking that we live as a reality. So when I'm in the States, I am more likely to get home alive because I'm a light-skinned, privileged person. And so it is very real. And amongst us in the States, we have a hierarchy of humanity too. So the light-skinned Black people in the States are more privileged than the darkest skinned Black people in the United States. So we call ourselves Black, but we actually practice the race paradigm, as do the Arabs among African people and so on. We see how cultural imposition affects our minds and our episteme from pre-birth to transition. We go to school to learn all these lies and to, in particular, learn about the hierarchy of humanity and where we place the white at the top, yellow, red, brown, and black at the bottom. And as I said, even within the bottom, it is still a color-coded scheme amongst us. So we live in a culture where we're programmed to hate ourselves. And we're taught to do that. It is actually a program. We say in Africology, as Africologists, with truth we can transform, and that truth is Ma'atic truth, grounded in the ancient principles of Ma'at. The clarity of cultural differences enables us to know the nature of the conquests across Africa and anywhere that Black people live. These cultural groups, and I say Black people because I also want to make it clear that the Australian original people are Black people who are Africans, who came from Africa. There's the attempt to erase that African history, but I think it's a very low percentage, and I'm sure Dr. McClandy can support me on this. I think it's something like 3% of those people are left. One of the things that is very positive is that during one of the ways of trying to whiten people up, which has been part of policy, European domination, the children there was the attempt to take the First Nations people of Australia and link them, breed with Europeans, and the children lost themselves, and they have now found their way back. So culturally, the people that they love are their Black ancestors, the First Nations people of Australia. And so because of the lightness of their skin, they're able to get privileges that their Black ancestors and families are not able to get, because they're culturally, they found their culture, and they're culturally African First Nations original people in Australia, which is very positive and something that we should look at in the big picture. So those cultural groups in Africa, they're everywhere, that believe in the inferiority of the darkest skinned people do not work in the interests of Africa. Couldn't be. Those African people, especially if religions accommodate these ideas, it's not impossible for light-skinned people, as we know, to find their African cultural heritage. That is not impossible, but there are people who practice anti-African, anti-Black beliefs all over Africa. Those African people who believe in European, Brahmin, Hebraic, Christian, Islamic superiority have had their minds inculcated with anti-African values and beliefs and have not escaped mentally. Joe showed us how to escape. Classical Africa before conquest teaches us who we are. As Sheikh Anti-Joke said, the history of Africa will remain suspended in air and cannot be written correctly until African historians connect it with the history of Africa. So, you know, we've made this a priority, a very important priority in the discipline of Africology, because we need to know Africa before conquest. So I hope that that's clear, and I'll stop my share. You know, do you have any comments? I know you must do. So,
first of all, I'd like to thank you for the panoramic sweep of your presentation. Very interesting, and I like the manner in which your manner of delivery, because you're dealing with a lot of detail, and the patience with which you've presented this findings, your research findings, couldn't have been more satisfying. A lot of issues that you dealt with. First of all, the thought of the great Senegalese scholar Cheikh Anta Diop, well, it's quite dear to me. And then the history of African people around the globe, and the ways in which new paradigms, new knowledge systems were established. First of all, of course, as you rightly pointed out, the first knowledge systems were created by Africans, based on matriarchy, and then how patriarchy was based on dominance and violence, and it managed to impose itself worldwide, and we still live on the patriarchal structures, which have in many ways distorted our world, made it quite difficult to live in, because it's based on violence and domination, and the control of other, and then I like the way in which you link that to other forms of violence, the violence of racism, xenophobia, sexism. classes, economic violence. I think you, and in fact, like I said, you are able to adduce or important scientific evidence to support your positions. I just wanted to maybe I should open the floor first of all to the audience to see if anyone or people have questions for you before I'll come later. But so what I'll do is to open the floor to our audience to see if they have any comments, questions, and interventions to your presentation. The floor is open.
Thank you.
Audience. Okay. Since this, I think maybe they're still pondering your presentation. So I'd ask.
It might seem crazy, you know, so people might want to be kind to me and, you know, and think, what was she, you know, but anyway.
Okay. You begin by discussing Diop.
Yes.
And then you went on to at least give us this presentation of, you know, how matriarchy was first the dominant paradigm of social organization before the overthrow of patriarchy. To what extent would you say Diop was in pointing this out to us and the kind of scholarship he produced to support this argument? That's one. And then the second one, question would be, what was the significance of Mahat, which was the original philosophy? What did he do? What did he accomplish? And how was it overthrown? So those are my two questions.
Yes, well, Mahat, we really, what Joe wanted us to do was to be able to look at classical Africa as the evidence of a time that we could see some of the sciences and ways of thinking and all the human developments within civilization of that time, and that have been codified so that we can say that this is written, we can see these buildings, we can walk around, we can know what was there before conquest. So he highlighted that, and he was also an Egyptologist. But he went beyond Egyptology, because Egyptology is a construct to make us think that it's a European culture, a European civilization. But Joe wanted us to see the African origin of ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt. And within that codification exist the principles of Ma'at. And the principles of Ma'at are very, very important, because she is a female divinity, but she is also considered to be judge. She is also stands for democracy, equality, harmony, peace, honesty and truth, all the very things that are thrown out in the conquering, you know, in the conqueror's ideas and knowledge. But this was something that was evident as central to the living of African people in their Kemetic times. So we are going back, you know, probably 10,000 years, but that has been restricted to 3,500, something like that, so that the Europeans who are trying to claim Kemet for themselves can be closer to the time in their own development. So Ma'at is within all the modern religions. In the Christian religion, the 42 principles of Ma'at, admonitions of Ma'at are, it seems to be the 10 commandments. So you can find evidence of these principles in the modern religion. But what happens, and it has been codified, it's been written what she represented or what Ma'at represented, and people tried to live in Ma'at. So to be Ma'atik was to be able to become the ultimate human that you could become. So these principles are modernized in terms of things called justice and so on. So in the time, say in the States, it is always Black people, always African people who are fighting for democracy, who are fighting for justice, who are fighting for truth, and little change is made. But through Africology and the idea of memory and learning one's cultural inheritance and legacy and beliefs and values, in learning that, there's the idea that there are the jewels of this ancient knowledge in the modern Africans who are fighting for justice. The justice is not American justice, because that's totally unjust, but it's for the African justice. So it comes out that way in the struggle, and also, so I'll just put it that way, the search for democracy, let's say. We can say that it is something that has been handed down intergenerationally, and that the concept, the belief in the ancestors, and this spiritual relationship and so on outside the modern religions, that messages and information are transmitted over generation, over thousands of years. So that's why we see culture as being something that is so powerful, and is beyond the restrictions of religion. So I think that's one part of your question. I'm sorry I took so long to answer it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm quite satisfied with your response. We have 2 questions in the chat. One is fairly long. I'll read the short one first. How do we apply Diop's findings to better understand and improve the current culture of rift between younger generations and elders? Are there any strategies in which we can find in Diop to address this cultural rift, as the speaker says, or writes rather?
Yes, I do think it's, because you have to look at how long it's taken us to get to this point, because it's a process where real information has been hidden and false information has replaced it. So, what is very important about culture is that it builds the institutions that reflect its values and beliefs. So institutionally, that is an important feature of culture, so that right now in the US, we're dealing with institutions that reify and reflect these racist, patriarchal beliefs. Every single institution, whether it's media, whether it's politics, whether it's economics, whether it's health, whether it's family, these institutions are the foundation that continue of society, but they they're fed by the cultural beliefs and values, and they reify those cultural beliefs and values. So institutional change is very important. There's one thing that one does to tweak them, and then one must have a vision of a different future grounded in those values and beliefs, and be building institutions that reflect those ancient African beliefs that are still there. Diop always saw, you know, in deep structure that they still exist, so that they can, the foundation of them is there. So Africa really is the source of all this knowledge, and the foundation whereby these principles could live. And those principles were practiced throughout the history of the beginning. And so it's an institutional thing, but an epistemological thing as well. And the Africology as a department struggles to exist because it's always getting its funds cut back. People moved out of it, you know, because it seems to be, it's a black discipline which loves humanity. So it fights against all the other disciplines, every single one of the disciplines inside the School of Liberal Arts. Every one of those disciplines is a racist discipline. It was either grounded in the blood of African people, or theoretically it believes in the inferiority of African people. All these disciplines, they, even when they're looking at liberation theories, building liberation theories, they can't, they're not really true, because they're constructed by people who don't believe in the liberation of African people, not true liberation. So, you know, Africology, wherever it is located, stands in defiance, and their cultures stand in defiance of each other too. They are opposing, they are opposite. So I think that the schooling begins with the tiny ones, you know, because they are the future. I think it's a slow process. In Africa, institutions can be built today that reflect these ancient values and beliefs, because those people still exist today in Africa. And there are remnants with people in the US, for example, or anywhere in the Americas. There are memories, remnants of that culture, and there are people who are trying to develop independent institutions that reflect their values and beliefs. This is ongoing. We're not alone. We're always having to see ourselves as these different groups of people, and actually we're very united in many ways. And Diop's work on using the sources, the resources of Africa, he's got two books that show that that Africa should be working towards getting outside the constructs, that the controlling constructs of Arabic domination and European domination, where we see ourselves as all these different nations, people in conflict, but it is actually a construct. We're supposed to be in conflict because so that the people who are really controlling the economies and politics of Africa can carry on while we're all, you know, separated and segregated and do not see ourselves as humanity. So institutions can be built in Africa today that really reflect those ways. And in the States, for instance, we try to create the independent Black schools so that students can, the little ones can grow up learning who they are, because they're not taught that at school. And school is one of the most major institutions for all people, whoever they are, anywhere in the world. That is a key institution. So, you know, it's a vision. We have to act upon it. And it's all about the episteme, and it's all about education and the mind. I hope I answered that in some ways.
I hope so too. Thank you so much. Divine has a question. Divine, your question is quite rather long. Well, please, would you like to say it? What you made a long remark and question, and then after that we would ask Charles to make his comments and ask his question. Okay. Let me Charles, would you go on and ask your question?
Thank you. Actually, it's not much of a question, it's a comment. I think in relation to the question that was asked, how can we help with the theories Diop has presented to bridge the gap between the generations? Just like Dav has explained eloquently, I would say that one of the things, I guess, which we struggle with ourselves as Africans is the inferiority of our knowledges. And so I'm speaking from Australia. It is very hard for our young people to identify with Africanity because it is looked at as inferior. And in fact, much of it is because we're ignorant of the dignity and contribution to civilization we have made. And so I think what we should be thinking of, just like Dav said, the knowledge that we so far have cherished and have elevated beyond anything else is foreign, and our own has not so much been elevated or has not been reclaimed. We have all now looked to Greece as the beginning of Western civilization, and we've never looked back to say, where did Greece borrow it from? And so what I'm thinking is the scholarship which Africa has, very robust scholarship, but it lacks its own institutions to promote Africanity. I'll give you an example as scholars ourselves. Journals that publish anything African, in our case in Australia, would be rated very low. They wouldn't help you for promotion. And so who doesn't want promotion? So we have to publish in journals that talk about other things apart from African. Where are African initiatives to curate our own knowledge? Where are African institutions that will say, yes, people write about Africa, but we would want to have African scholarship that describes things African, and maybe even vet things which are written about Africa and Africans. So I think the generational gap, in my view, begins with we ourselves, because we are children of a colonized generation, and the knowledge that we elevate is foreign. And I think our children don't have much that they can look at. Instead, they have much to be ashamed of, and they don't want to associate with it. So they would want to associate with something else. So I suppose we should be looking at how we can promote institutions of scholarship in Africa about Africa. I happen to have been teaching a contemporary Africa course in the University of Victoria, where I am. But as Na says, such courses survive out of very little support. In fact, much of it has been whittled away. So it's very hard to promote that. And the African Studies Association of Australasia and Pacific over the years has requested if government would fund the programs on African studies. Now, there's no money for that. There's no money for that. There's no money. There's money for everything else, but not for that. So I am pleading, African scholars, we should be thinking of establishing our own centers of scholarship about African and African knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that insightful comments. There's one more question. Professor Dove, thank you for your patience. I hope you're not too tired.
No, I'm in the morning here. Charles is in the he's in the midnight area, aren't you?
Yes, just 4 minutes before 2 a.m. of Thursday.
Wow. Divine has a question for you. He says he thanks you for your presentation, and he wants to know how much we should read Diop's thinking within the context in which he was located. That is in Senegal, and in which is a deeply patriarchal context, and also within the context of Islam, which is also patriarchal, and then within the context of post-colonial African nation, which is Senegal, which is also under French colonial or political domination in one way or the other. So he wants us to, how in these levels, how do we read Diop to understand him from his own particular positionality?
Right. That's what the thing about Joe to understand is the major contribution he has made for us to understand the significance of culture, but to also recognize that he holds on to certain things that he's been taught and trained to believe in Senegal. That's why you're raising this. To recognize that, and one must use his teachings to the best of, what they can do overall. And it's, I don't really see a contradiction, because I feel that we're all in one way or another attached to bits of this conquest, that we're entrapped, if you like. But, we still must speak truth regardless of the entrapments, and the more that we understand truth, the more that our logic, because you cannot have logic without truth, and the idea of these races is not true, and so one comes up with ideas to solve this that are actually illogical, because we're believing in something that isn't true, and even though it's imposed upon us and we're acting it out, we have to, still spread the message however we can. Africa is the place in which this will happen. This is the cradle of human life, and even though we're constrained by all these things, one avenue, as Charles mentioned and as you mentioned, Dr. Sanyo, is that the writing, we're writers and thinkers, and it is there that we have to meet to discuss ways that we can move forward, because it's the brain that we have to develop among ourselves. And we can't just be individuals trying to do this. We actually have to meet or form groups across the world. It's not impossible to do, where we can speak the truth and talk about ways of instituting those truths. Diop left a legacy of ways that Africa can work together to use its resources in the interests of all the people in Africa. And in that way, you know, those resources would spread to all the people, you know, who are impoverished by being so-called African, the blackest-skinned people. I think it's an African responsibility. We're not. There are times when we don't even challenge the information that we're forced to read and forced to answer to. We're not even critiquing it. You know, we've got an amazing, right now, we've got decoloniality going across Africa. Everybody's taking that in and loving that. And it is about epistemology, it's about episteme, it's about knowledge. The only failing of that, which is much more reasonable than any of the other theories, Western theories that have come, is that it doesn't love Africa from its ancient times. That's completely missing. So it's moving towards Africology by saying that we must understand what has happened to us, the conquest, the colonization, all that. But it doesn't give power to the people that were conquered by it. It recognized the terms, the ways, the complexities, but not really where we go. It's just about recognizing, and that's very powerful and very good. But it should be recognizing the greatness of Africa, the greatness of the indigenous people of the world, their massive accomplishments, First Nations people, all those things, and they're coming out of a sort of First Nations dialogue, if you like, but they're still kind of colonized because they're not remembering or knowing or putting forward the idea of the great accomplishment. And in part, the reason for this is because progress, what we've been taught progress is that, you know, these things that we have now, these you know, technological things and so on and so forth, that we have come forward, and we used to be hunter-gatherers, and we used to be people who didn't know anything. This is not true. But the thing is that it stops us from looking back, because we think, well, we were monkeys and we knew nothing, you see, and we move forward on this evolutionary scale. But when we actually look at Africa, we see that, you know, we had scientists thousands of years ago who are now reduced to being people that have nothing and know nothing. That is happening in Africa. So it means that we are looking at ourselves from this alien eye that was pointed out, and not doing the research that can teach us who we really are. That type of work has to be done. As I said, decoloniality has its worth because it really spells out the horrors, but it doesn't spell the solution. And the solution is not to say, you know, go back to knowing nothing, because that was never true. It's about go back to learning what we knew, because we've fallen from that. We haven't progressed. As long as we look at it as a global scale and say that we progress as individuals, which is, you know, inside the patriarchal thing, individualism, we don't care about the rest of the world. That's not an African way at all. We know we've been dominated when it's just about how well I'm doing and my family's doing. Because if the people of the world are not being fed, It's madness to think that that's evolution and this is progress, complete madness. But anything that we've attained and obtained of privilege that we can use, we have to use that, you know, but we have to see the enormity of the world. And can't, if one country's doing well, that's not enough. It's everybody.
Thank you so much, Professor Dove, for that insightful remark and comment. Thank you for your time, and thank you for the presentation, which has been quite thoughtful, provoking. And this is a kind of conversation we need to continue. I'm sure it's not going to end here, but unfortunately, we've come to the end of the seminar. We've run a bit over time. And so, yes, on behalf of HUMA and the Director of HUMA, Dr. Divine Fo, and the HUMA team who are here, and their audience, thank you, Charles, for your very powerful insights. We really appreciate it. We thank all of you for being here, and we'll see you hopefully next month. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sacha.
It's an honor. Thank you.